What's up everybody, and welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For all of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and part of my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of China. I started making these videos for my mates back home, and they said you should throw that stuff up on YouTube, so I have. I spend about 15 to 20 minutes every week talking about the big macro developments coming out of the country, so you're on top of what's going on here. If there's something you might be interested in, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. For everyone else, welcome back. It's good to see you. As always, it's a massive help if you smash that like button. I'm producing this in China. I have to use a VPN. And man, YouTube does not like VPN users coming out of China at the moment. It throttles the videos. So the biggest piece of help you could do is if you enjoy the content, please smash that like button. It's a massive help. So guys, this week it's been a pretty crazy week. There's been a lot on. I actually had about 10 stories, and I've whittled that down to about 6 or 7 that I'm going to go through. At the moment, as I film this, Beijing is in the middle of hosting its Lianghui, or its 2 sessions meeting. This, of course, is an institution that's often criticized as being a rubber stamp parliament, and I think that characterization is pretty accurate, to be honest. It normally meets in March. This time, of course, this year, it was postponed by 8 weeks because of the outbreak, the corona outbreak earlier in the year, obviously, and we discussed that when that happened at the time. But it is still going on as we do this. I want to see the final announcements and readouts from the 2 sessions, and I also want to see the analysis in both English and Chinese. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into what was discussed and what was passed next week, with the exception, of course, of the proposed national security law change vis-a-vis Hong Kong. We are going to touch on that in this episode and probably have a bit more analysis in the next episode because it's just so important. But there is a lot that happened last weekend and earlier in the week, like Huawei, like the World Health Organization's assembly, like the second term for Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan. All this stuff needs to be discussed. So that's what we're going to focus on this episode. It should be good. Hopefully it's not too long for you guys. Let's jump in. Let's talk about the controversial Chinese technology company Huawei, and how actions over last weekend suggest that we are moving into a period which could be described as the beginning of a technology war between the United States and China. Over the weekend, the US Department of Commerce made the following announcement, quote, "The Bureau of Industry and Security today announced plans to protect US national security by restricting Huawei's ability to use US technology and software to design and manufacture its semiconductors abroad. This announcement cuts off Huawei's efforts to undermine US export controls." End quote. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Co., the largest chip maker in the world and largely recognized as the best chip maker in the world as well, has halted new orders from Huawei in response to these new export controls. This will be a difficult move for the Taiwan-based company, as 20% of its gross revenue came from the mainland Chinese market in 2019. However, it doesn't have much choice in the matter because 60% of last year's revenue came from the United States. This week too, the US chip giant Global Foundries also announced that it had halted operations at a joint venture factory in the People's Republic of China. Experts have been talking about and warning for some time of an upcoming technology war between China and the United States. And it looks like technology companies engaging in work where their products may touch on sensitive areas or national security may increasingly find themselves in a position where they have to pick a market to exclusively sell to. Huawei's chairman Guo Piang said in a statement that the US decision meant, quote, "Our business will significantly be impacted," and that this would be a huge shock to the industry. State-run media all week have written a series of articles highly critical of the US decision and promising countermeasures and responses from the Chinese side. For example, the nationalistic Global Times said in a couple of articles that China was preparing countermeasures and that they could threaten measures against US firms like Apple and Boeing. Let's talk about the World Health Organization's World Health Assembly, which commenced online. It was a 2-day event and it started on Monday. Taiwan Foreign Minister Joseph said on Monday that Taiwan had removed its bid to have observer status had a seat at the meeting of the World Health Organization's decision-making body, saying that the WHO had given into pressure from mainland China and wouldn't allow Taiwan to attend. He also said that the meeting should focus on containing the global pandemic. This is the more pressing issue, and that the question of Taiwan's status in the body can be re-examined later in the year. Now, the WHO's Director General does have the authority to allow Taiwan to attend as an observer, and in fact, every year from 2009 through 2016, the WHO did just that. On the first day of the meeting, General Secretary Xi Jinping made a speech addressing those at the session. In his speech, the chairman said, quote, "China will provide $2 billion over 2 years to help COVID-19 response and with economic and social development in affected countries, especially developing countries." On the point of intensifying global pressure to have an inquiry into the outbreak and its original handling, Xi Jinping said this, quote, "China supports the idea of a comprehensive review of the global response to COVID-19 after it is brought under control to sum up experience and address difficulties, which must be based on science and professionalism, led by the WHO and conducted in an objective and impartial manner." Xi Jinping also claims that China throughout this entire process had been, quote, "open, transparent, and responsible." The European Union submitted its draft resolution for the would-be investigation to, quote, "identify the zoonotic source of the virus and the route of introduction to the human population," unquote. In that draft, there was no requirement that the investigators look into the initial mishandling at the initial stages of the outbreak. US President Donald Trump also threatened to permanently end US financial support for the WHO unless it committed to, quote, "substantive improvements within the next 30 days, end quote, and declared that, quote, "China has been anything but transparent," end quote, in its response. Australia worked very hard and very vocally in the early days to try and put together a coalition of countries to push for an inquiry, even if it was through the highly criticized WHO. It seems that these efforts were quite successful, although the Chinese embassy in Canberra, Australia, seems to disagree, saying in a statement on Tuesday that Australia claiming any credit or vindication for this is, quote, "nothing but a joke," end quote. Chinese state media was harsh too, with the nationalistic Global Times writing a piece quoting netizen comments approvingly, with one quote calling Australia a, quote, "giant kangaroo that serves as a dog to the United States," end quote. Whether Australia deserves credit or not for its initial moves and support for an international independent inquiry into the coronavirus outbreak, it seems that it is now suffering economic pain from the Chinese side for being so early and so proactive in calling for such an inquiry, and it is likely that there is going to be more on the way. Okay, next up, I want to talk to you guys about a couple of little economic updates this week. Normally we do a bigger update, but next week after the full breakdown with the Hui, the 2 sessions, there's going to be a lot on economic policy, economic challenges, and we're probably going to have better data and policy directions going forward. So next week is going to be a big economic heavy episode. So this week I just want to touch on I originally didn't actually want to talk about the economy at all for that reason, but there is a couple of little updates that I want to tell you guys about this time. On Monday, the Ministry of Finance released data showing that China's fiscal revenue shrank 14.5% year on year to 6.21 trillion yuan, about $900 billion during the January and April period. On Monday, Bloomberg News reported that its sources said that Chinese oil consumption had largely recovered since its 20% shock in the first quarter, largely fueled by increased use of private vehicles, with people using cars and avoiding public transportation. And one extra little piece this week before I move on, Reuters this week reports that in the US, widespread discussions are underway regarding mass decoupling from China, including the idea of a reshoring fund, originally worth about $25 billion to encourage US companies to dramatically change their relationship with China. And now another quick story before we go into our bigger ones. Let's talk quickly about the border issues currently with India. There's been some tensions at the border. This is something that's been going for a few weeks now, and I was trying to find the right time to talk about it. It's deserving of a large episode because it's a real structural problem that has existed for decades, but for several major reasons, this issue is becoming increasingly acute, and it's deserving of a larger more time to discuss. But it's quite a heavy episode this week, so I just want to touch on a couple of the developments over the last few weeks so you're abreast of it. So there have been renewed border tensions between China and India, which have escalated over the last few weeks. So on May 5th, around 250 Indian and Chinese army personnel clashed with iron rods, sticks, stones. People were even throwing stones at each other around the Pangong Tso Lake area. So this is on the border between the two countries. In this encounter on the 5th, there were serious injuries sustained on both sides, with soldiers and personnel having to be hospitalized. Now, there was a different incident, and this involved about 150 personnel and soldiers, Indian and Chinese. This was on the 9th of May, so this was 4 days later. In this case, there were 10 soldiers from both sides that sustained injuries, according to both the Chinese side and the Indian side. Now, these standoffs took a more serious turn this week after the Chinese side brought in troops, so they've increased their troop levels to the area, and heavy equipment from a military exercise that was being conducted nearby in the region. China and India have been having sporadic border disputes and tensions, scuffles, and even one war for decades now. So this is not a particularly new problem, but like I said, it looks like the situation could be getting worse from a structural perspective. The militaries from both sides are currently in negotiations to find a way for both sides to de-escalate without losing too much face. As of the filming of this, those discussions are still underway, and they're currently being characterized in Indian media as in deadlock. Okay guys, now one of the big stories that I'm sure a lot of you have already been following because it's been all throughout the news, and I know a lot of people that watch this are interested in developments in Hong Kong and developments in terms of the relationship between Hong Kong and the mainland under the one party, two systems framework, particularly since the protests in the special administrative region started last year. So I'm sure you've been following what has happened this week with the two sessions, but it's worth going through some of it now so we can unpack some of it. There'll be more analysis on this next week, I'm sure. This week during the two sessions, China introduced a draft resolution to allow the National People's Congress to pass legislation for a new national security law specifically for Hong Kong, criminalizing, quote, secessionist, subversive activity, foreign interference, and terrorism, end quote. The move would give Beijing far more control over the special administrative region and further undermine Hong Kong's semi-autonomy, rule of law, and comparatively strong freedoms. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I always like to look at proposed laws. I actually haven't seen the draft. I haven't seen any language from it. Hopefully I'll be able to have a look at it when it is released, but it is expected to be approved during the annual session of the National People's Congress, which, like I said, is, as of the filming of this, is currently underway. It could allow the mainland government to go after large protests in Hong Kong. Now, the National People's Congress spokesperson Zhang Yesui said in a statement to reporters on Thursday night that the proposed law change was 为了坚持和完善一国两制制度体系是完全必要的, which is basically saying that the law is indispensable. It is absolutely necessary in order to protect one country, two systems. So this is the position in Beijing. The South China Morning Post also reported that one of its Chinese sources close to people making decisions in Beijing said Beijing had concluded that it was impossible for Hong Kong's Legislative Council to pass a national security law to enact Article 23 given the city's political climate, which is something that also failed in 2003 and at that time caused the largest protests in Hong Kong's history up until that point. So the central government had deemed it necessary to step in and pass this legislation. It is highly, highly likely that this move will further agitate the already very acutely volatile political environment in Hong Kong and draw large protests. Indeed, there was already political controversy earlier this week from the fallout of attempts to pass a national anthem bill, which would prescribe a fine of up to 50,000 HKD and 3 years in prison for persons who disrespect the national anthem. Now, remember last year we were talking about the passing of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Those of you who've been watching me for a few months now know that last year this was passed and it was signed into law by the president, and it requires that the State Department produce a report every year assuring the Congress that Hong Kong still maintains a high degree of autonomy from Beijing. Well, on Wednesday, the Secretary of State, Pompeo, said in a statement, quote, "In Hong Kong, our decision on whether or not to certify Hong Kong as having a high degree of autonomy from China is still pending." He went on to say, quote, "This week, pro-democracy legislators were manhandled while trying to stop a procedural irregularity by pro-Beijing legislators. Actions like these make it more difficult to assess that Hong Kong remains highly autonomous from mainland China." End quote. Okay, next up, I want to talk about lending to developing countries. This is also a story that I've wanted to talk about for some time. It's always developing, but it seems in the current economic environment internationally, now is a good time to bring it up. President Xi Jinping's $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative, a highly ambitious project to finance infrastructure projects in many parts of the developing world, has resulted in high levels of lending to poorer economies. This lending has courted interest and criticism both domestically and internationally, and over the last few weeks some of its economic and political risks have reared their ugly heads, with debtor nations now seeking debt relief from Beijing. Chinese state-run bank loans to developing countries often had higher interest rates than international lending institutions and frequently used national assets as collateral. These factors compensated for the higher risk of lending to developing nations with weaker institutional protections for things like property. Economically, this makes sense, but there is a political component too. Taking national and strategic assets, particularly if it's for feeding the population, for example, is not particularly popular, particularly when you do it at a time when many are angry at you or believe that the reason they can't pay is because of disaster that you yourself caused. And at a time when there's extra scrutiny on your behavior overseas, it has a lot of political costs. Not to mention it can damage the bilateral relations that you sought to actually improve in the first place by handing out these loans to develop infrastructure in some of these economies. Now, given there is an argument that this may not be their primary objective, which we touch on shortly, and perhaps we can talk about in a larger episode when we look at the motivation behind this foreign policy decision. But if on the face of it, it is to improve relations, then this certainly undermines that objective. Debt levels in Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central Eurasian nations that have accepted loans now sit at about 20% of national GDP for countries like Ethiopia, and as high as 80% of national GDP for countries like Djibouti. Now that is not all debt, that is just debt to China. On the point of debt lending generally as well, Chinese debt overseas has been increasing at quite a steady rate over the last few years. According to the Washington-based International Institute of Finance, China's outstanding debt claims on the rest of the world passed 5.5 trillion USD in 2019, or approximately 6% of global GDP. But $500 billion of this was given to the developing world, according to the German-based Kail Institute. When China seized the strategic seaport from Sri Lanka a few years ago, this raised a lot of red flags in debtor nations, not just amongst politicians, but the general public too. This anxiety, as well as stories of corruption and cases of very expensive infrastructure projects that failed to get off the ground, has led to criticism and suspicion in many debtor nations, again, amongst political and elite circles, as well as within the general population. Now, like I said, in the current atmosphere, there is a lot of pressure, a lot of debtor nations facing large recessions and perhaps an inability to pay back some of the high interest debt which is secured against strategically important assets. China has dismissed the idea of mass debt forgiveness, but has signaled that it is willing to negotiate terms to reduce debt. But China is in a bit of a pickle here. If it forgives loans, that could strain its financial system and really piss off Chinese people who, from the beginning, many were not very happy with this arrangement, and they've got their own economic concerns at home. Why are you forgiving debt overseas when Chinese households have high levels of debt and there's still poverty in the countryside? But if China demands repayment, it will hurt relations with many nations that are already very angry at China due to COVID. Debt to developing nations has also attracted criticism from many quarters, particularly from many in the West. who've accused the PRC of so-called debt trap diplomacy. I actually think that this is unlikely on balance, and that the higher interest rates and the collateral were because of the higher risk of lending to some of these countries, particularly those that had very weak rule of law. It looks like the banks were willing to make the risk or take the risk in exchange for the higher interest rates. But over the last few weeks with the current developments, it looks like this risk may not have paid off. Okay, last up, let's talk again about Taiwan. During the week, Taiwan's leader Tsai Ing-wen celebrated the inauguration of her second term. In her inauguration speech, Ms. Tsai said, quote, "In the face of complex and changing cross-strait circumstances, we have made the greatest effort to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait over the past 4 years, gaining approval from the international community. We will continue these efforts, and we are willing to engage in dialogue with China and make concrete contributions to regional security. Here, I want to reiterate the words peace, parity, democracy, and dialogue. We will not accept Beijing authorities' use of one country, two systems to downgrade Taiwan and undermine the cross-strait status quo. We stand fast by this principle." End quote. On the mainland, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Taiwan Affairs Office, and the Ministry of Defense were all quick to denounce statements that were made by the United States State Department, as well as other actors in the US government, for the congratulations of Ms. Tsai, and in particular the language that they used while giving those remarks, which indeed were probably the most provocative that were used by US actors for some time in discussions about Taiwan. Beijing was particularly incensed that US Secretary of State Pompeo referred to Ms. Tsai as, quote, Taiwan's president, unquote, and that he referred to a, quote, US-Taiwan partnership, end quote, in his statement. In relation to these 2 points in particular, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said, quote, "The above-mentioned moves constitute a severe violation of the One China principle and the 3 China-US joint communiques, and a serious interference in China's internal affairs. China expresses strong indignation and condemnation of such moves," end quote. The Ministry of Defense employed even stronger language, saying, quote, "The Chinese People's Liberation Army has the strong will, full confidence, and sufficient capacity to thwart any form of external interference and any separatist attempts for Taiwan independence," end quote. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this week's China Update. I hope you enjoyed it. I put a lot of work into putting some of those sources together. Each one of those stories comes from 30 to 40 different sources, so it's a pretty well-rounded look at what's going on. If you have any questions or any comments, if you agree or disagree with my analysis, please throw your points below. I would love to hear from you guys, as always, or whether you just want to chat, that's cool too. But as always, I will see you guys next week on China Update.